invasion of Iraq. It was bad before, but within a year, Bush and his advisors have turned the United States into a pariah state. It's greatly feared throughout the world. It's regarded as the greatest threat to world peace by substantial majorities. Back last October, the national press was forced to recognize, I'm quoting, that the world is more concerned about the unbridled use of American power than they are about the threat of Saddam Hussein. Actually, that's an understatement. No matter how much the world hates Saddam Hussein, it's only in the United States that he's feared. No one else regarded him as a threat, including his neighbors. They hate him, but they're not afraid of him. That's a special U.S. property. That's reached the point where the fear and concern over U.S. power has been featured in the national media recently, cover stories in Newsweek and the Washington Post recently. There's one of the major polling centers, the research centers, is the Pew Research Center, recently published a poll on the image of the United States around the world, Europe mainly. It's plummeted. It's particularly Bush and his associates. In most places it's still dissociated from the country, though there are some exceptions like Poland and Turkey where the country is feared and hated. But it'll follow. If they keep at it, it'll follow. It'll be not them, but everyone. The head of the non-aligned movement, that's governments of roughly 80% of the world's population, former colonies basically, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia, who's very pro-American, very much part of the whole U.S. international economic project, what's absurdly called globalization. He recently said that the United States today, under the current leadership, is more dangerous to the world than Hitler. That wasn't reported here. We want to stay in the cocoon, but it was reported elsewhere, like England. You want to get out of the cocoon, you should know that. Well, you look beyond, it gets, in some ways, even more remarkable. You all know, I'm sure, that every year the World Economic Forum has a meeting usually in Davos, Switzerland. It's usually very upbeat and enthusiastic. Not this year. This year there was an atmosphere of what the press called gloom. The theme of the meeting last January was building trust. And the reason for that was that the World Economic Forum had just done a poll which they'd released about trust in leadership around the world, and they'd found a sharp decline in trust. There was only one, they had various categories. The only category that had even a slight majority of the population trusting them was non-governmental organizations. Right below them came the UN and spiritual and religious leaders. Below them were Western European leaders. Keep going down, you get the corporate managers. The very bottom, leaders of the United States. It's pretty amazing. Colin Powell was sent there by the administration as their emissary. He had a very rough time. He was bitterly condemned. The focus of the meeting was the coming war with Iraq, which they were strongly opposed to, and they weren't by no means impressed with Powell's proclamation that the U.S. Declares the sovereign right to use force as it wishes. It's going to lead, even if nobody's following. Didn't win a lot of hearts and minds. This, remember, is the core of the international establishment. These are the people who the business press calls the masters of the universe. It includes corporate executives who are paying $30,000 each to attend, and major figures everywhere. That kind of opposition to government policy is completely without precedent. And it extends right to the United States, at the heart of the elite opposition to the political leadership is, again, extraordinary. The major foreign affairs journals, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and others. Popular opposition also has absolutely no precedent. There was an international Gallup poll. It wasn't reported here. Again, preference for the cocoon last December. The results were pretty interesting. We'll run through them, but just one result, one question asked had to do with the war that Bush and Blair and Powell and the rest are declaring and are now carrying out, a war that they carry out without any calling themselves the Allies, but they're allied only in the sense that they're allied against almost universal world opinion. The coalition forces, as the propaganda system calls them. A war carried out by them didn't even barely reach 10% support in any of the countries polled. The opposition in Europe was greatest in the countries that were where the leadership was lining up with Washington over the overwhelming opposition of their own population. That's incidentally being lauded here in a demonstration of hatred and contempt for democracy that also has no precedent. David was making jokes about France, but the reason for why France and Germany are so reviled is that the governments are taking the position of the overwhelming majority of the population. And that's considered a crime. It's a pretty striking fact. The governments that are praised, what Rumsfeld calls the New Europe, they're countries where the leadership is taking their orders from Crawford, Texas, and disregarding 90% of the population. Those are the good guys. Now, what this tells you about the attitude towards democracy among elites here is pretty astonishing. Don't have to comment on it. I'm sure you noticed that the biggest demonstrations by far in mid-February, were in the countries where the leadership was going along with the United States, Italy and Spain. Same figures are same right through Eastern Europe. So Hungary, for example, has also about 80 or 90% opposition to the war under any circumstances. And the Latin America, of course, overwhelming opposition. There's always overwhelming opposition there to U.S. military intervention, which they've had a little bit of experience with. When the Allies had to have their summit meeting, in which they presented an ultimatum to the United Nations, and not to Iraq. They presented an ultimatum to the United Nations, Bush, Blair, Aznar, saying, you follow us in 24 hours or else. Where did they meet? Well, they couldn't meet in any country where there are people around. That's too dangerous. They met in a U.S. military base on an island. That's where you got to meet, like the World Trade Organization, which had to meet in Doha to make sure there's no demonstrations, be surrounded by navies. That tells you a lot. Well, it's a real achievement, and you really have to ask how, let's say you're this Martian observer, how did Bush and his associates manage to make themselves the most feared and hated political leadership in the world, in fact, maybe ever, shaming the country and ultimately endangering its people? How'd they do it? Well, you look back, you can see how they did it. Just without running through the whole story, just start last September, because there was a big change then. Last September, a lot of important things happened, and they made an effect on world and U.S. opinion. The first and most important was the declaration in late September of the National Security Strategy. Immediately and surprisingly, it was harshly criticized in the main establishment International Affairs Journal, Foreign Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, which they do it in sort of muted terms, but you could see the concern. It was called an Imperial Grand Vision. The government announced a pretty remarkable doctrine. Basically, what it came down to is that the U.S. is going to rule the world by force, That's the dimension in which it has overwhelming dominance. The U.S. probably outspends the rest of the world combined in military force by now. It's going to rule the world by force, and it's going to do it indefinitely. If the U.S. government perceives any potential challenge to its domination of the world, it's going to destroy it. That's the doctrine that was announced. It's usually in the press, it's called a doctrine of preemptive war. That's not what they announced. Preemptive war has a meaning. It means that if you're under attack, you're under imminent threat of attack, like, remember back in 1983, the Russians were going to bomb us from an airbase in Grenada. Well, okay, say the Russian planes are in Grenada and they're flying to Florida about to bomb us, then a preemptive war would mean you're allowed to shoot them down before they bomb, and maybe even bomb the threatening airbase in Grenada. That's preemptive war. It has to be an imminent attack that's taking place. That's not what was proposed in September. What was proposed is that they can attack anybody they decide to call a potential threat. Sometimes that's called preventive war, but even that's not fair because they're allowed to invent the threat. It's not preventing anything necessarily. That's the doctrine that was announced. The goal, to quote somebody else, was to use force to prevent any challenge to the power, position, and prestige of the United States. And no legal issue arises if the U.S. acts to prevent any such challenge. That's now the position of the rulers of the country that outspends probably the rest of the world combined in means of violence, or close to that. And it's now forging new and very dangerous paths over near unanimous world opposition. Most striking and dangerous of them is the development of lethal weaponry in space, which really does pose a threat to survival of the species. Well, I mentioned I was quoting someone else, and it's important who it was. It was Dean Acheson, a respected elder statesman, senior advisor of the Kennedy administration. Quotes what he said in 1963, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost led to terminal nuclear war. The roots of the missile crisis were a campaign of international terrorism that the Kennedy administration was carrying out again in order to carry out what's now called regime change in Cuba. And we know why. Part of the freedom that we've obtained, if we want to use it, is that we have unusual access to internal secret government documents. They get declassified. There's thousands of pages of them on this. We can choose to ignore them if we want, or we can look. And if we look, we find that the reasons for the campaign of international terrorism were that the very existence of the Castro government is a successful challenge to U.S. policies that go back 150 years. What does that mean? Well, it's 150 years of U.S. policy saying you follow our orders or else. And the existence of that regime was successful defiance of that. Furthermore, it was regarded as a threat because of the possible spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which has great appeal to people in the region who suffer from similar forms of oppression. We got to stop that. 150 years of policy tell us that. Well, that was the reason for the international terrorist campaign, led right to the missile crisis, almost nuclear war, just learned how close it was. After the crisis was over, the terrorist campaign was renewed, along with economic strangulation, and right at that point, Dean Acheson informed the American Society of International Law that no legal issue arises in the case of a U.S. response to a challenge to its power, position, or prestige. Well, that's approximately the Bush doctrine of September 1992. And this is the opposite end of the political spectrum, remember. And that's important to know. We want to understand ourselves, remember what the political spectrum is. Well, why the